Okay, it's starting.
Perfect. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Some of you may know me already or have attended one of these closeout classes or a federal aid class that I did. But just in case you haven't, my name is Arlene Coker, and I'm a project engineer for QRSE. And we're here for the second part of the closeout training today. We'll cover the closeout of utility agreements, memorandums of understanding, or MOUs, facility relocation agreements, or FRAs. Those are the three types of utility agreements that HDOT has with utility companies. And as we always do, I have some initial questions for you to see what you already know. I'll show the questions in the slide, and then Tiffany will launch the poll, and you should get a pop-up on your screen to be able to answer the poll question, or you can answer the poll when it shows in the chat pod. So here we go. The first question. When can you start the closeout process for a utility? Is it A, when the work is completed for that utility, B, only after final acceptance of the entire project, or C, when the work is completed for all utilities? And if you go ahead and publish, Tiffany, that would be fantastic. So there are about 27 of you. I'm going to wait until we get to 18 or 20. So get your votes in, please. It looks like most people are thinking when the work is completed for the utility so far. Although a few think you need to wait for all the utilities to complete their work before you can start closeout. I'm hoping for a couple more responses. Although if you joined late, you probably can't see the poll in the chat. Okay, we'll go ahead. So the answer is when the work is completed for that utility. So most of you knew that already. So that's excellent. So the next question, which of these things need to happen first? Send the final closeout letter to the utility, prepare the utility cost calculation, or send the utility closeout transmittal to Highway SF. Which one of those needs to happen first? If you could publish that poll, Tiffany. So we're split between preparing the utility cost calculation or sending the final closeout letter. Those so far are the two choices. Most of you think it's prepare the utility cost calculation. So that is the correct answer. You have to prepare that utility cost calculation before you can send the letter, the final closeout letter to the utility. Excellent. And the last pretest question. How many days are allowed from substantial completion to utility final statement to highway SF? 40 days, 180 days, or 365? How many from substantial completion to the final statement to highway SF, the final utility statement to highway SF? You can go ahead and publish that one, Tiffany. No, we're 50-50 between 180 days and 365. Okay, it's still a 50-50 split. The answer is 180 days. 180 days allowed from substantial completion to the final utility final statement to highway SF. Okay, so that's all. That's the pretest. And as you know, I like to start with the core values: accountability, safety, community, innovation, and teamwork, because the core values help guide what you do in your work every day. And as we said in the last training, Closeout focuses on the core values of accountability and teamwork. Accountability in this case is to the utility company for the work that's been done to their facilities, and also to the public who uses those utilities. Teamwork's also about working with the utilities to close out the agreements and resolve any financial obligations with the work. But it's also to Highway SF. We have to have teamwork between construction and Highway SF to go ahead and close the agreements and then ultimately close the project completely. So there are 3 different types of agreements for utilities. A memorandum of understanding, known as an MOU, has a maximum dollar amount of $250,000. And that limit applies to both private and public utilities. A utility agreement is for utility adjustments that are more than $250,000. Depending on the nature and complexity of the utility agreement, utility adjustment, a UA may be required for adjustments that are less than 250,000. So it just depends on the complexity, right? You'll need a utility agreement to iron out all those details. And then a facilities relocation agreement, or an FRA, is an agreement between a federal agency and the state. And there's no maximum or minimum dollar amount for this type of agreement. These definitions are from section 6.7, utility design, of the project development manual, and the costs have been updated to the higher amount of $250,000. The manual still says 50,000, but there was a memo to update that to $250,000.
Arlene, when does a federal, the FRA, come into play at all?
I would say it's if you are doing work on federal lands, maybe if the state is doing that work rather than the federal agency, or if it happens to be some utility that runs along your facility that a federal agency might own that goes to their property, but also has to cross your property. So it's some kind of utility that a federal agency has control of.
Got it.
At least that's my understanding, Randall. Okay, good question. So let's look at the timeline for a utility closeout. The left side of the timeline is substantial completion, and the right side, or the end of the timeline, is the period of performance end date. Now, just to refresh, federal projects have a period of performance, and this is the time frame to spend federal funding on your project. Expenditures outside this time frame are considered ineligible. So you want to make sure all your work is completed and the project is closed out by the end of the performance period so that all of those costs can be considered for federal eligibility. Okay, the timeline. The justification of construction performance period, or the JCPP, allows 180 days from substantial completion to the time that you submit the utility final statement to Highway SF. The 180 days includes 40 days to prepare the cost data. Then that's according to Socrata. The JCPP allows 15 days. And just a note here, as last time, that the closeout process is still evolving. We're working on this process. So if you have questions about how much time you should allow for any of these tasks, ask your supervisor. The cost data includes the utility cost calculation, the UCC, the final utility payment standards comparison, or the UPSC, and the original UPSC from the utility agreement, plus the plan sheets showing the work completed. And you'll send all of these with a utility closeout letter to the utility company and request a response within 90 days. So they'll either agree with the costs or they'll provide their costs. That's the hope. So 140 days are allotted to get agreement on the costs. Once you have the costs from the utility, you submit the final statement to Highway SF. They have 30 days to collect the funds from the utility or pay the utility what the state owes them and then close the agreement. Fiscal still needs 120 days to do their work to close the project at the end. Sometimes it takes more than 90 days for the utility to respond. There are about 115 days or 3.5 months of float in this timeline, but you need to make sure you can still close all agreements at least 120 days before the end of the performance period to allow fiscal the time they need to close the project. Now, this is the current process, but I'm proposing a slight change to try to get agreements on the costs before substantial completion instead of after substantial completion. So this timeline shows an individual utility. Thank you for the thumbs up. You'll notice that the left side represents when the utility finishes their work and the right side is substantial completion. So this timeline, the right side of this timeline matches the left side of the previous timeline that I showed. As each utility finishes their work, within 30 days, you should prepare all the cost data that we talked about. The utility cost calculation, the payment standards comparison, and have the original payment standards comparison from the original agreement, and the plan sheet showing the work completed. The difference here is you send a cost agreement letter and ask them to agree or provide their numbers within 90 days. And there's a template for the cost agreement letter. It's the same as the final closeout template, but it indicates that you're not going to begin closing out the agreement until you reach substantial completion, but you're working with them to try to get agreement on the final costs, right? This allows you to begin working with the utility as soon as their work is completed and hopefully have agreement on costs by the time you reach substantial completion. So we have a template for the cost agreement letter. We also have a checklist to help you walk through this process. The checklist shows those same steps. Within 30 days after the utility work is finished, you prepare the utility cost calculation. Then you prepare the utility payment standards comparison based on the revised costs. Make sure you have the original cost comparison from the initial agreement. And then you include all these items in that cost agreement letter, give them 90 days to respond. When they do respond, you file their response and you have it and wait until substantial completion. It's a good idea to say it's a good idea to stay connected to these utility representative, whoever your point of contact has been on the project, so that you know if your request is being processed through their administrative and their finance offices, and you have an idea of whether they have revisions to the estimate or they agree with your estimate. So you can kind of keep tabs on, how is it moving through the process? And are they going to be able to respond to you in a timely manner? So this is the existing process and timeline. But if you follow the new process I described, you can shorten the time it takes to close out the agreement when you get to substantial completion. You can now shorten the time it takes to put together the closeout letter and information to 15 days. And because you have prior agreement on the costs, you only need to give the utility 30 days to respond. And you can send the final statement to Highway SF in 45 days, which is well within the target of 180 days. Now, realistically, there are two scenarios here. The one I just described, where the utility responds with their costs before you reach substantial completion, which is ideal. But real world is not always ideal. So the other scenario is that they didn't respond. They haven't responded. You're at substantial completion and they still didn't respond. If they haven't responded, you still send the final closeout letter and ask for a response within 30 days. And then, continue to try to work out getting their cost estimate, right? So the checklist also includes these new steps at substantial completion. But, well, I'll tell you when we get there. At substantial completion, so within 15 days, after substantial completion, you send the final utility closeout letter with their response to the cost. So the great news is if they respond, then you remind them, here's how you responded before, and we're going to close out this contract because we're at substantial completion. And then you can also transmit the information to Highway SF so that they can pay the utility or request payment from the utility for the work that's completed. So it helps speed that process along. So the other reason to send the cost agreement letter within 30 days from completion of the utility work is that it starts the clock on the time allowed for the utility to respond. Your letter gives them 90 days, and the goal is to have agreement on the final costs within 90 days. If you have difficulty getting a response from the utility, the longest you should have to keep the agreement open is 1 year based on federal requirements. According to 23 CFR 645-117I, the utility company has 1 year from the completion of the utility relocation work to provide one final and complete billing of all the costs incurred, or to agree to the lump sum that's already in the contract. Otherwise, the previous payment, so if you already have paid the utility, then that'll be considered final, unless you've agreed to another cost between the state and the utility. The other thing is Exhibit B of the utility agreement, the section responsibilities of the company, item 1C, also states that the utility will pay the actual cost of any repairs performed on or behalf of the State Department of Transportation within 1 year from the satisfactory completion of such work, provided that such repairs are not caused by or attributed to the fault of the state. So in case something, there hasn't been damage once they were installed. So this is the new process that I'm suggesting that you use to try to speed up closing out utility agreements. But the great news is that 1 year is the longest time you have to keep it open, because the utility has a responsibility to respond to you within 1 year with their final costs, according to federal regulation, and also according to the utility agreement that they signed when you started the project. So are there any questions about this process? See anything in the chat so far? Excellent. I love it when it's clear or completely confusing and you don't know what to ask. I'm going for clear. Going for clear. So if you don't have questions, you know I have questions for you. There's always a post test. Okay, excellent. We'll move to the post test. All right. When should you start the closeout process for utilities? If you would publish that poll, Tiffany, please. Should you start it at substantial completion of the project, completion of all utility work, or when an individual utilities work is complete? So we have a mixed bag here. A few people think substantial completion of the project, some completion of all the utility work, and then most of you think when the individual utilities work is complete. And so that's the correct answer. When the individual utilities work is complete, you want to start putting together the information and sending them that cost agreement letter. Okay, which of these should happen first? Send the cost agreement letter to the utility, send the utility closeout transmittal to Highway SF, or send the final closeout letter to the utility. If you would go ahead and publish that, Tiffany, and thank you for closing the last one. Which do you do first? Send the cost agreement letter to the utility, send the closeout transmittal to Highway SF, or send the final closeout letter to the utility. We're going to see if we get a few more responses. Okay, you can close that poll, Tiffany. Thank you. So the answer is send the cost agreement letter to the utility. Now, some of you did say send the final closeout letter to the utility, and that would be the old process, right? You do, but the new process to hopefully get agreement earlier on the cost is you send that cost agreement letter to the utility as after they finish their work. I keep trying to give away the answer here on this question. So you should send the cost agreement letter to the utility within how many days from completion of their work? 30 days, 90 days, or 180 days? You can publish that poll, Tiffany. Thank you. Okay, I think it's settled a little bit there. Tiffany, you can go ahead and close that poll if you'd like. So the answer is 30 days. So you want to send that cost agreement letter to the utility within 30 days of completion of their work, because it'll help you start working with the utility early, but it also starts that 365-day clock, because once you send them the final cost estimate, then they have 365 days to give you their final costs. Okay, I think this is the last post-test question, and then I have a feedback question, so don't hang up. Which of the following are included along with the cost agreement letter? Now, this one you can select all that apply, right? You can do multiple answers here. You want to check as many that do apply. The utility cost calculation, the final utility payment standards comparison, the original utility payment standards comparison, plan sheets showing the work, and or a check to the utility company. Which of those things are included with the cost agreement letter? And you can select multiple answers. You should select all that apply. Tiffany, if you'd go ahead and publish that one. Okay, looks like you guys did very good. You can go ahead and close that poll, Tiffany. Thank you. So the answer is everything but a check. You don't send them a check with the cost agreement letter. You want to give them all of the information that you have about what the costs actually are, show them what work has been done, and then ask them to, if they agree with those costs or they want to provide their own costs if there's a discrepancy that they have in their records. So the utility cost calculation, the final utility payment standards comparison, the original payment standards comparison, so they can see what changed from the original agreement, and then the plan sheets showing the work. And that'll also show the changes if there were any, right? So they know how you came up with your costs. So the last question is for me, please. If you would just give me some feedback on how you would rate the usefulness of the training content. Was it not at all useful, somewhat useful, adequate, useful, or very useful? If you publish that one for me, Tiffany, thank you.
Hey, Arlene.
Yes.
Hey, I wanted
Hi.
to, hi, good morning, guys. I've been listening in, but I wanted to, if it's okay, I wanted to say something. Randall asked the question yesterday, and I know, um, I've been asked it before, right? By construction guys especially, right? The question was, what can we do if they're unresponsive, right?
Yes.
Utilities, and how can, if they, initially I was unprepared to answer it with confidence, I guess. But so I said what I know to be true, which is really that kind of decision is up to the state, right? I mentioned that the 365 was a federal law, but nothing prevents a state from making it a requirement either as part of the contract or even, if Ed wanted to, he'll go make it law, if he found it a big enough issue. Unfortunately, we all know utilities are quite the powerhouse in Hawaii, and that's for all lines of business, all areas of business. But I did want to make a comment today after I had time to think about it. Number one, thank you for the training. You highlighted some very well-known information, but you highlighted some well-known information. You pointed out steps that supposed to be standard, but I can tell you through my experience with federal highways, and overseeing all the federal projects, we've struggled in the utility area. So those steps, even though it may be obvious, it's not always followed. So
Okay.
you guys getting it organized and bringing it to the surface is key, right? So again, back to that question Randall asked, what can we do? One of the things that was talked about, this was a while back with leadership is, before we go cracking down on the utilities, we needed to take inventory of what was happening on the DOT side. And quite honestly, we found a handful of different things, right? It's like, how do we go after the utilities if on our side, we're not following all the steps you just shared today, right? So anytime you address a big issue like unresponsive utility companies, we also, I feel like, and you guys done this already, we got to look in-house, right? What are we doing? What are we not doing? Is there anything we're doing that is leading to the problem or contributing to the problem? And I thought about our history of projects that couldn't be closed because we didn't have utility agreements. When Lisa and I dug into them, it was found, in a lot of occasions, DOT didn't follow certain steps or maybe even follow up. There was no evidence in place to suggest DOT did their due diligence. So how are you going to go ahead and go after the utilities, right? So with that kind of information in hand, to me, the best way to go about addressing utility problems in the future is to get organized in-house like you guys are, right? As you guys come out with these tools and you go, maybe, when e-construction starts documenting when you guys did what, transparency comes into play, and then it's easier to hold accountable parties or easier to hold responsible parties accountable. So just kind of taking a step back, showing the big picture that as you guys get more organized, we move into e-construction and you're able to document how you did things, and then the patterns show itself of say utilities being unresponsive, right? It makes it easier for Ed and Robin and now Larry to go have those conversations with the utilities and say, guys, look at, you guys are showing a pattern of unresponsiveness, and this is really messing us up in ways A, B, and C. A lot of times funding, right? Closeout, jeopardizing federal funding. So I don't know if I was clear, but I'm trying to take a step back into where I stand and where we stand as federal highways and what we look at and how what you're talking about today fits into that overall process, right? As you guys get more organized, essentially your leadership can take a more firm stance with utilities. And, after a while, right, like any escalation process, you can start looking at writing in either law or something that they'd be willing to take to court should they have to contend with the utilities. So this the information covered today might seem small, but I believe it's critical in the overarching issue of addressing utilities and kind of, neutralizing their power. We all know how political utility companies are, but that doesn't mean we cannot do our part, which is following those steps, document it, and then showing it to the people who can stand up for us. So I believe that's what you guys are doing. And for me, that's the picture I see. I wanted to mention it today because I want, inspectors, when they've got to go through their steps, they may not think it's critical, right, to document or to send follow-up or to meet those timelines, but it actually is, right? And as we get better at it, I believe change is possible. Already it's gotten better. You guys don't know how many projects were open because of utility agreements, even when the utilities were owed money, right? They weren't coming after it just because it got so convoluted. So thank you for giving me a couple of minutes to share the bigger picture, but I'm hoping that bigger picture provides some perspective and allows, of course, construction engineers know, but those inspectors, the guys that maybe make the calls and send out the letter or does the calculation or eventually, fills out the checklist is actually very important. So anyway, that's what I got. Hope it allowed for a little bit of perspective and a little bit of where I come from and what we look at on the federal highway side.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kaha'a. And it's true, the first look is, are we following our own procedures, right? To make sure that we're following the process, and then we can start talk about the rest of it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and then you mentioned, for instance, a suggestion. You said you'd like to start the negotiations ahead of substantial completion.
Yeah.
As we get the process laid out of what we're doing and what we need to do and what we don't need to do and what we can do better, that's the kind of suggestions that really come into play. I mean, without assuming know what you know. If you negotiate the earlier you negotiate, once you have all the information you need to make an agreement, it's always better, right? Anything could happen
Right.
as a construction engineer. At the end, they could run their numbers and be like, "Holy shit, we're in the hole," or our profit margin isn't where it needs to be. I know this is on the contracting side, but on the utility side, on any negotiation, the earlier you start, the more information you have, the better negotiations start. And from where I sit, it doesn't look like there's no reason, once you have all the data, to start those conversations when you have the data instead of after substantial completion. Again, just taking one suggestion you put out. I know there's many areas that you guys will eventually look at and seek to make more efficient. And it isn't always about time either, guys. I want to point that out. One thing I noticed in those conversations, right? We allow 365. In my opinion, that's absurd, right? I mean, what utility company, they're not going to pick it up to day 325, right? If I work for the utility company and was being honest. But then there's other processes where we say 30 days, right? And the utility company might say, oh, God, we got to do all these different things. Requires, it go to this office or that office. So we may need 60. That's that give and take to really establish a fair process so you're not disappointed over and over again on the DOT side. But again, those conversations can only be had once you guys get organized, get comfortable with what your process flow is, and then we can move into that step. So anyway, guys, thanks for the time. And thanks for going after this. This is a big one. Smaller now, but still big, and I think important as we go forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much. I hope you all have a great day. That's all I have, unless there are questions. I don't see any.
Arlene, is this on the Wiki site?
Not yet, but it will be.
Okay, got it.
It will be. And I have taken notes. So we will provide the letters and some examples so that you can see what you should expect back from a utility. They are supposed to use the UPSC form so that you can, you send them the cost comparison and then they're supposed to respond back in that form, but you may not get it that way. But that's what you use to do the comparison. So we'll put all those resources when we make this post on the Wiki. As you suggested, Randall, that was a great addition. Anything else?
And then I'm gonna ask a dumb question, but you may have already said it if I missed it. Eventually, are we looking at as you guys know, I love this term. Well, at least I've got used to it for 10, 15, 20 years. Electrify the process, meaning e-construction. You know this, Arlene, right? Hey, e-construction wasn't always
no, it was not. That's right.
A brand term, right? Back when we started.
That's right.
15 years ago is when I really started digging into it. But anyway, what do we know? Or is that something you guys have on the list of things to do? Is it 2-3 years out, 1 year out, a couple years out?
For utility agreements?
Tracking the utility process in e-construction. Notice how I'm staying very general.
Yes. I think now we have tools. So as we submit or have conversations, right? We need to, I think the practice, so we won't have anything other than email, as far as I know. Kathleen, help me if I'm wrong. To correspond to the utility, but the idea is to keep track of that workflow. So yes, we may be able to do some workflows on our side, at least with Highway SF. And maybe we can do at least a workflow to get to what we need to send to the utility. So would it be more, I would say in this case, it's more of a workflow than it is. Yeah.
And that's what I was talking about. I realized the limitations, but I wasn't asking specifics for timeline, but you answered my question by kind of identifying what's possible. And I know you guys will do it on your guys' timeline when you guys see it as, necessary. So, all right, thanks for that.
Kathleen, did you have anything to add?
Well, I guess there's a few options, Kaha'a, that I think it'll be really good to kind of get together with a focus group. So there's a tool that can basically you can put in milestones. It doesn't require any scheduling software, but you can just say, here's some milestones, and you can kind of assign those milestones to people, and the people don't even have to be in the system. As long as it's an email address, and the system itself will follow up on them. And
That's
then there's
awesome.
also you could track things simply as like, this is a thing, an issue that I want to track. And you can put that through a kind of a watch list situation. And we, if we do it that way, then we can actually have dashboards that show us when those deadlines are approaching. So part of it is
Awesome.
figuring out, like, given the tools that we have, what would be that 90-foot level versus 90 billion foot level that people would want to see. So it would be good to have like representatives from the different groups kind of talk about what they look for. And so then we can find kind of the tool that would have those outcomes. If that makes sense.
Yes, 100%. And again, my question was more so to get an idea of when we'll start having data. I know in previous conversations, again, I referenced those leadership conversations. They were super positive, right? When Ed got out there and stood up for DOT and said, "Hey guys, right, you guys aren't being responsive to my staff. We want to get you paid, and we're gonna eventually just not pay." He took, like Ed does, takes a firm stance. But what was missing at the time was data. So I guess today's question, or my last question, was regarding, all right, when we're gonna have a little bit of data to kind of keep track of how the flow is working on our end, and Kathleen, what you mentioned, if you guys do that or anything similar, would already, in my opinion, would be multiple, a good number of steps in the right direction already forward.
Yep.
Okay. Very good. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.